never imagined my own blood would turn against me like this. Watching my daughter-in-law silently dig under the moonlit sky, burying a box in my garden at midnight, it shattered something deep inside me. The woman who promised to love my son forever was destroying the very foundation of trust I'd built over 73 years of life. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Margaret, and I live in a small apartment on the south side of Chicago. The building is old, with creaky floors that announce every footstep and radiators that clang through the night like restless spirits. My windows overlook a narrow courtyard where I've managed to coax roses to bloom despite the harsh Illinois winters. Those roses have been my companions for 8 years now, ever since Harold passed away and left me with nothing but memories and an aching silence that fills every corner of this place. The morning it all began, I was standing at my kitchen window, watching the sunrise paint the Chicago skyline in shades of amber and gold. My hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug, Harold's favorite, the one with a faded Cubs logo that he'd drink his coffee from every morning for 23 years. The coffee was bitter, cold from sitting too long while I stared at my phone, waiting for a text that never came. My son Michael had promised to call the night before. We'd made plans to have lunch at that little diner on State Street, the one where he used to love their chocolate chip pancakes when he was 8 years old. But the call never came. The lunch never happened. And now, at 6:30 in the morning, I stood in my empty kitchen wondering if I'd done something wrong, wondering if I'd said something to upset him, wondering why the people I love most seemed to drift further away with each passing day. The apartment felt smaller that morning, cramped with the weight of unspoken words and broken promises. Every piece of furniture told a story: the worn velvet armchair where Harold used to read his newspapers, the dining table where we'd hosted Thanksgiving dinners for 30 years, the bookshelf crammed with photo albums that no one looked at anymore. The air smelled of coffee grounds and something else I couldn't name. Something that reminded me of loneliness. I'd been living this routine for months now. Wake up before dawn. Make coffee I couldn't taste. Stare at the phone. Wait for someone to remember I existed. The days blended together like watercolors left in the rain, each one grayer than the last. My arthritis made every movement a small negotiation with pain, but the ache in my joints was nothing compared to the hollowness in my chest when I realized that the people I'd spent my life loving had somehow learned to live without me. That evening, as the sun disappeared behind the concrete towers of downtown Chicago, I heard footsteps in the courtyard. Not the usual shuffle of Mrs. Chen taking out her trash or the quick clip of young professionals hurrying home. These were slow, deliberate, careful. I peeked through my curtains and saw her, Sarah, my daughter-in-law of 6 years. She was carrying something heavy, something that made her shoulders strain and her breathing labored. At first, I felt a flutter of excitement. Maybe she'd come to visit. Maybe she'd brought dinner or wanted to apologize for Michael missing our lunch date. Maybe this was the moment when we'd finally bridge that gap that seemed to widen every time we were in the same room. But then I noticed the time on my kitchen clock. 11:47 at night. Who makes social calls at midnight carrying heavy boxes? I watched her from behind my thin curtains, my breath fogging the glass as she knelt beside my rose bushes. The moon was full that night, casting everything in silver light that made the scene feel like something from a dream. But dreams don't leave you with the cold, sinking feeling that settled in my stomach as I watched her dig. Dreams don't make your hands shake the way mine did when I realized she was burying something in my garden. The box was metal, about the size of a shoebox but heavier. She struggled with it, pausing every few moments to look around, to make sure no one was watching. But I was watching. I was always watching, always hoping that someone would include me in their lives, even if it was just to witness their secrets from behind a window. She covered the hole carefully, patting down the dirt and arranging the mulch around my roses as if nothing had happened. Then she stood, brushed the soil from her knees, and walked away without ever looking up at my window. Without ever acknowledging that she'd just violated the one small piece of earth that still felt like mine. I stood there for an hour after she left, staring at the spot where she'd buried whatever she didn't want found. My mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. Was it money? Documents? Something illegal? Something that would hurt Michael? The questions multiplied like weeds, choking out any chance of sleep that night. You know, I've spent most of my adult life trying to be the mother, the grandmother, the woman that everyone could depend on. I made myself available for every crisis, every celebration, every moment when my family needed someone to lean on. I never asked questions about late-night phone calls or sudden changes in plans. I never demanded explanations for missed dinners or forgotten birthdays. I just smiled and made excuses and told myself that love meant never keeping score. But lying in bed that night, staring at the ceiling while the radiator clanged its familiar tune, I realized I'd been keeping score all along. Every ignored call, every broken promise, every time I felt like a burden instead of a blessing, they'd all been adding up in some secret ledger in my heart. And now, watching someone I'd tried so hard to love treat my home like her personal storage unit, that ledger felt impossibly heavy. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in Harold's chair and remembered the early days of my marriage to Michael's father. We'd been so young, so certain that love was enough to weather any storm. Harold had been a good man, the kind who brought me coffee in bed on Sundays and held my hand during thunderstorms. He taught Michael to ride a bike in Grant Park and showed him how to bait a hook on those summer trips to Wisconsin. When Harold's heart gave out 8 years ago, I thought I'd lost the only person who truly saw me, who truly valued what I had to offer. But Michael had been there then. 33 years old and devastated by losing his father, he'd held my hand at the funeral and promised we'd take care of each other. "It's just us now, Mom," he'd said, and I'd believed him. I'd believed that losing Harold would bring us closer, that grief would be the bridge between my generation and his. For a while, it seemed like it might work. Michael called every few days. He'd stop by on weekends to help with repairs around the apartment or to share a meal. We'd talk about Harold, about memories that felt sacred in their simplicity. Those conversations were a lifeline during those first terrible months of widowhood, when every familiar sound reminded me of what I'd lost. Then Sarah entered the picture. I first met her at a coffee shop in Lincoln Park on a crisp October morning 3 years after Harold passed. Michael had been nervous, fidgeting with his watch the way he used to do before piano recitals when he was 12. Sarah was beautiful in that effortless way that some women possess, dark hair that caught the light, careful makeup that looked natural, clothes that belonged in magazines. She smiled at me over her latte and said all the right things about how much she'd heard about me, how excited she was to finally meet Michael's mother. I wanted to love her. I wanted to see in her the daughter I'd never had, the woman who would make my son happy and give me grandchildren to spoil. I tried to ignore the way she checked her phone while I talked, the way her smile never quite reached her eyes when she looked at me. I told myself that she was just nervous, that it would take time for us to find our rhythm together. But time didn't help. If anything, it made the distance more obvious. Sarah had opinions about everything, the way I decorated my apartment, the foods I cooked, the stories I told about Michael's childhood. She never said anything cruel, never raised her voice or made a scene. She was subtler than that, deadlier than that. She'd make suggestions that felt like criticisms, offer help that felt like judgment, smile while delivering little cuts that took days to heal. Michael couldn't see it. Or maybe he chose not to see it. Love has a way of making us blind to the flaws in the people we care about most. When I tried to talk to him about Sarah's comments, about the way she made me feel small and unnecessary, he'd get defensive. "She's just direct, Mom. She doesn't mean anything by it. You're being too sensitive." Too sensitive. Those words followed me home from every family gathering, every dinner where I felt like an intruder at my own son's table. I started to second-guess every conversation, every gesture, every moment of hurt or confusion. Maybe I was being too sensitive. Maybe I was expecting too much. Maybe this was just what it felt like to get older, to become the kind of person that younger people tolerated rather than truly welcomed. The engagement happened on a Thursday in May. Michael called to share the news, his voice bright with excitement and promise. I congratulated him, of course. I told him I was happy for him, that Harold would have been proud, that I couldn't wait to start planning the wedding. But after I hung up the phone, I sat in my kitchen and cried for reasons I couldn't fully explain. The wedding planning was a masterclass in polite exclusion. Sarah would ask for my opinion and then explain why my suggestions wouldn't work. She'd include me in conversations about flowers and music and guest lists, but somehow my preferences never made it into the final decisions. I paid for the rehearsal dinner, emptied my savings account to make sure my son had the kind of celebration he deserved, and watched from the head table as Sarah's family gave speeches about love and commitment while I sat silent, forgotten, unnecessary. On the wedding day itself, I wore a navy blue dress that Sarah had approved of and a smile that felt like it might crack if I held it too long. I watched Michael promise to love and honor this woman who'd slowly, systematically removed me from his life, and I told myself this was what letting go looked like. This was what good mothers did. They stepped aside and let their children build new lives, even when those new lives didn't seem to have space for the people who'd loved them first. The first year of their marriage was a slow erasure. Phone calls became text messages. Text messages became silence. Sunday dinners became monthly obligations that felt more like charity visits than family time. I'd cook meals that went cold while Sarah talked about her job, her friends, her plans for redecorating their apartment. Michael would eat quietly, occasionally meeting my eyes with expressions I couldn't read. Was it apology? Frustration? Or had he simply learned to see me through Sarah's eyes, as someone whose time had passed, whose relevance had expired? I tried to be understanding. Newlyweds needed space to build their relationship. They were busy with work and friends and all the complications of adult life. But understanding didn't make the loneliness any easier to bear. Understanding didn't fill the empty hours or quiet the voice in my head that wondered if this was how people disappeared, slowly, one cancelled plan at a time, one unanswered text message at a time, until they were nothing more than names in phone books and faces in photographs that no one looked at anymore. Harold and I had always talked about growing old together, about becoming the kind of grandparents who spoiled their children's children and told embarrassing stories at family gatherings. We'd imagined Sunday dinners that stretched into evening, holidays that required extra chairs around the table, a house full of laughter and noise, and the beautiful chaos of a family that chose to be together. Those dreams felt like cruel jokes now, promises that life had broken without asking my permission. The second year brought small cruelties disguised as kindness. Sarah would invite me to events, birthday parties, holiday celebrations, casual get-togethers, and then spend the evening making sure I knew I didn't belong. She'd introduce me to her friends as Michael's mom in the same tone she might use to say Michael's dentist or Michael's accountant, someone necessary but not particularly interesting. She'd guide conversations away from topics I might contribute to and towards subjects that highlighted how different we were, how little I understood about her world and its priorities. Michael seemed oblivious to these subtle orchestrations. He'd see me at family events and assume I was having a good time because I was there, because I was smiling, because I never complained. But I was learning that there are different grades of loneliness, and the kind you feel in a room full of people who've forgotten you exist is perhaps the most devastating of all. That second Christmas was when I realized how completely I'd been replaced. I'd spent weeks preparing gifts for Michael and Sarah, carefully choosing items that reflected their interests and my love for them. I'd made my famous sugar cookies, the ones Michael had requested every Christmas since he was 5 years old. I'd decorated them with colored icing and wrapped them in festive tins, the same way my mother had taught me 40 years earlier. When I arrived at their apartment on Christmas morning, I found a house full of Sarah's family and friends, people who greeted me politely but didn't move to make room for me in their conversations. My gifts were opened with distracted smiles and set aside for gifts from people who mattered more. My cookies sat untouched on the kitchen counter while everyone raved about the elaborate dessert spread that Sarah's sister had provided. I left that gathering after 2 hours, carrying my tin of rejected cookies and a heart so full of hurt I thought it might stop beating altogether. Michael walked me to my car, kissed my cheek, and promised to call soon. He never mentioned that I'd left early. He never asked if I was okay. He never seemed to notice that I'd spent Christmas morning sitting alone in a room full of his family, watching him build a life that had no meaningful place for me. The next few months blurred together in a haze of ignored text messages and canceled plans. I'd send pictures of my roses blooming in the spring, hoping to start conversations about the garden Harold and I had planted together. I'd forward articles about subjects I thought Michael might find interesting. I'd suggest lunch dates and movie outings and simple ways we might stay connected. The responses, when they came at all, were brief and non-committal. "Looks nice, Mom. Thanks for sending. We'll have to do that soon." But soon never came. Instead, I learned about their lives through social media posts that made me feel like a stranger peering through windows at a family I didn't recognize. Photo after photo of Sarah and Michael at restaurants I'd never heard of, vacation destinations they'd never mentioned, celebrations I hadn't been invited to attend. I'd study these images for clues about who my son had become, about whether he ever thought of me when he was living this beautiful life that seemed to require nothing I had to offer. The money started disappearing in small amounts at first. $20 here, $50 there, amounts that could have been honest mistakes or fees I'd forgotten about. I'm not someone who pays close attention to every transaction, not someone who guards my bank statements like state secrets. Harold had always handled our finances, and after he died, I'd learned to manage the basics without worrying too much about the details. But then the amounts got larger. $100, $200, $500. When I called the bank to ask about these withdrawals, they told me someone with access to my account had been making regular transactions for months. Someone who knew my PIN number and had a copy of my debit card. Someone I'd trusted enough to help with grocery shopping and prescription pickups during the winter months when my arthritis made driving painful. I stared at those bank statements for hours, trying to understand how trust could be transformed into theft so easily, so quietly. Each unauthorized withdrawal felt like a physical blow, not because of the money itself, but because of what it represented. I'd given Sarah copies of my cards to help with errands, the same way I might share them with my own daughter if I'd been blessed with one. I'd never imagined she'd use that access to fund her own life at the expense of mine. When I called Michael to discuss the discrepancies, his response broke something inside me that I'm not sure ever fully healed. "Are you certain you didn't give her permission?" he asked, his voice carrying the tired patience adults use with confused elderly relatives. "You know your memory hasn't been perfect lately, Mom. Maybe you just forgot. Your memory hasn't been perfect lately." Those words echoed in my head for days afterward. Was that how he saw me now? As someone whose recollections couldn't be trusted, whose version of events was automatically suspect? I'd spent 71 years building a reputation for honesty and reliability, and my own son was dismissing my concerns as the confused ramblings of an aging woman whose mind was starting to fail. I hung up that phone call feeling smaller than I had in years. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was forgetting things, agreeing to financial arrangements that I couldn't remember later. Maybe this was what getting older meant, losing not just your independence and your energy, but your right to be believed when you said something was wrong. But the withdrawals continued, and my certainty grew stronger. I started keeping detailed records of every transaction, every conversation about money, every time Sarah had access to my purse or my wallet. The pattern became impossible to ignore. She was taking money regularly, systematically, in amounts carefully calculated to avoid raising immediate suspicion. She was stealing from me with the kind of methodical planning that suggested this wasn't impulse or desperation, but strategy. The confrontation, when it finally came, was worse than the theft itself. I invited Sarah for coffee on a Tuesday morning, choosing a public place where she'd be less likely to make a scene. I brought my bank statements and my careful records, determined to handle this calmly, rationally, with the dignity befitting someone who'd lived long enough to deserve basic respect. She denied everything, of course. But her denials came too quickly, with too much detail about transactions she should have had no knowledge of. She suggested I was confused, that stress and grief were affecting my judgment, that perhaps I should speak to my doctor about memory issues that seemed to be causing these paranoid thoughts. She turned my confrontation into evidence of my decline, my struggle for truth into proof of my instability. "I'm worried about you," she said, reaching across the cafe table to pat my hand with false sympathy. "Michael's worried too. We think you might be having some problems that you're not aware of. Maybe it's time to consider getting some help managing your finances, your daily life. There are wonderful facilities for people in your situation." People in your situation. The phrase hung in the air between us like smoke from a fire I hadn't seen coming. She wasn't just stealing my money, she was stealing my competence, my credibility, my right to advocate for myself. She was painting me as someone whose protests couldn't be trusted, whose claims of mistreatment were symptoms rather than facts. And she was doing it all with the kind of concerned smile that made her cruelty look like kindness. That night, I sat in Harold's chair and tried to make sense of what was happening to my life. I'd raised a son who'd grown into a man I was proud of. I'd welcomed his wife with open arms and an eager heart. I'd tried to be the kind of mother-in-law who supported rather than interfered, who offered help without demanding gratitude, who loved without conditions or expectations. How had those good intentions somehow transformed me into a problem to be managed, a burden to be endured, a woman whose own account of her life couldn't be trusted? The roses in my garden had been Harold's idea originally. He'd come home from the hardware store one spring with 4 small bushes and a smile that suggested he was planning something special. "Every beautiful woman deserves flowers," he'd said, kissing my cheek while I laughed at his transparent attempt at romance. We'd planted them together that weekend, taking turns with the shovel and arguing good-naturedly about spacing and soil preparation. Those roses had survived Harold's death, 8 Chicago winters, years of my amateur care and uncertain attention. They'd bloomed faithfully every summer, providing color and beauty in a concrete courtyard that desperately needed both. They were my connection to Harold, my proof that love could create something lasting and beautiful even in unlikely places. Watching Sarah dig among them that midnight felt like watching someone desecrate a grave. After she left, after I'd spent hours staring at the spot where she'd committed her secret burial, I made myself a cup of tea and sat at my kitchen table trying to decide what to do next. Part of me wanted to march outside immediately, to dig up whatever she'd hidden and confront her with the evidence of her deception. But a larger part of me was afraid of what I might find, afraid that knowing the truth would somehow make everything worse. Because the truth, I was beginning to understand, wasn't just about money or midnight visits or mysterious boxes. The truth was about who I'd become in my own family's eyes, someone whose concerns weren't valid, whose instincts couldn't be trusted, whose presence was tolerated rather than valued. The truth was about how easily love could be transformed into condescension, how quickly care could become control, how thoroughly someone could disappear while still sitting right there in full view. I'd been disappearing for years, I realized. One dismissed concern at a time, one ignored invitation at a time, one "you're being too sensitive" at a time. Sarah's midnight burial was just the culmination of a longer, subtler process, the slow erasure of Margaret from her own life, the careful transformation of a mother into a problem, a woman into a cautionary tale about the burdens of aging family members. The next morning brought rain that turned Chicago streets into mirrors reflecting the gray November sky. I stood at my window watching people hurry past with umbrellas and purpose, wondering if any of them had ever felt as invisible as I did in that moment. My reflection in the glass looked smaller than I remembered, more fragile, less substantial. When had I become the kind of person who could be dismissed so easily, whose concerns could be explained away as symptoms of decline? I called Michael that afternoon, choosing my words carefully, trying to find a way to discuss Sarah's midnight activities without sounding paranoid or confused. But before I could even begin to describe what I'd witnessed, he interrupted me with news that made my heart sink even further into the isolation that had become my constant companion. "Mom, Sarah and I have been talking, and we think it might be time to discuss your living situation," he said, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone delivering news they knew would be unwelcome. "This apartment is getting too much for you to handle alone, and we're worried about your safety. We found some really nice places that might be better suited to your needs." Your needs. As if he had any idea what my needs actually were. As if safety meant anything in a world where the people you loved most could discuss your future as if you weren't capable of participating in the conversation. As if nice places could somehow compensate for the loss of autonomy, dignity, and the right to live in the home you'd chosen for yourself. I'd heard this conversation happening to other women my age, friends whose children had decided they were no longer competent to manage their own lives, neighbors who'd been relocated to facilities where their needs might be better met by strangers paid to care about their welfare. I'd always felt sorry for those women, but I'd never imagined I'd become one of them. I'd never thought my own son would look at me and see a problem requiring a solution rather than a mother deserving love and respect. "I'm fine, Michael," I said, hearing the defensiveness in my own voice and hating how it made me sound exactly like the kind of stubborn elderly woman who couldn't accept reality. "I can still take care of myself. This is my home." But even as I said the words, I knew they sounded hollow. Because home isn't just about walls and furniture and familiar surroundings. Home is about being with people who see you as you truly are, who value your presence, who treat your thoughts and feelings as valid and important. And by that definition, I'd been homeless for a while now, living among people who'd learned to see me as a burden rather than a blessing. The conversation ended with promises to think about it and talk more later, the kind of non-commitments that really mean the decision has already been made, and I'm just being given time to adjust to the inevitable. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen surrounded by the artifacts of a lifetime, photo albums filled with happier memories, Harold's coffee mug still holding a place of honor beside the sink, the recipe box full of dishes that no one requested anymore, and wondered how long I had before these remnants of my history would be packed into boxes marked "Mom's Things" and stored in someone's basement. That evening, as darkness settled over Chicago and the city lights began to sparkle like earthbound stars, I found myself drawn back to the window overlooking my small garden. The spot where Sarah had buried her secret was barely visible in the gathering dusk, but I knew exactly where to look. Whatever was down there represented something important enough to risk being caught, something valuable enough to justify late-night deception, something that someone desperately didn't want discovered. I made a decision that night. Tomorrow, I would dig up that box and discover what my daughter-in-law had been hiding. Not because I expected to find anything that would change Michael's mind about my competence or Sarah's character, but because I needed to know the truth, even if the truth couldn't set me free. Especially if the truth couldn't set me free. Because that's what 73 years of life had taught me. Sometimes the truth is all you have left when everything else has been taken from you. Sometimes knowing what really happened is the only dignity remaining when people you love have decided you're too old, too confused, too inconvenient to deserve honesty in your relationships with them. Sometimes the truth is the last thing standing between you and complete invisibility. I went to bed that night with my mind made up and my heart prepared for whatever I might find buried beneath my roses. But I never could have prepared for what I actually discovered, or for how that discovery would change not just what I knew about my family, but what I understood about myself and what I was willing to accept in the name of love. The morning came with unusual warmth for November, as if Chicago itself was offering encouragement for what I was about to do. I waited until 9 o'clock, when the courtyard would be empty of commuters and dog walkers, when my neighbors would be settled into their daily routines and unlikely to notice an elderly woman gardening with unusual intensity. I'd found Harold's old gardening tools in the coat closet, relics from the days when he'd helped me tend to plants that actually thrived under our combined care. The small shovel felt heavy in my arthritic hands, but determination can provide strength that you didn't know you still possessed. I knelt beside my roses, feeling the damp earth soak through my jeans as I began to dig where Sarah had disturbed the soil 3 nights earlier. The box was exactly where I'd expected to find it, about 18 inches down and carefully wrapped in plastic to protect it from moisture. It was heavier than I'd anticipated, made of metal with a latch that opened easily despite being buried. My hands were shaking as I lifted the lid, partly from the physical effort of digging and partly from the knowledge that whatever I found would change everything I thought I knew about my family. Inside the box were documents. Bank statements with my name on them, but showing account activity I'd never authorized. Signed forms that gave Sarah power of attorney over my finances, documents I'd never seen before carrying what looked like my signature. Credit card applications in my name, loan documents, investment papers, an entire financial life that someone had been living under my identity for months. But that wasn't the worst of it. Beneath the financial documents were printed emails, conversation between Sarah and Michael discussing my declining mental state and their plans for managing the situation. Email after email detailing their strategy for documenting my supposed incompetence, their timeline for moving me into assisted living, their division of responsibilities for liquidating my assets and taking control of Harold's life insurance money. I sat there in the dirt beside my roses, surrounded by evidence of a conspiracy so thorough and calculating that it took my breath away. These weren't the actions of a desperate person making poor choices in a moment of weakness. This was a systematic plan to steal not just my money, but my independence, my dignity, my right to make decisions about my own life. This was elder abuse disguised as loving concern, theft masqueraded as family responsibility. One email in particular made my hands shake so violently I almost dropped the papers. It was from Michael to Sarah, dated just 2 weeks earlier. Mom called again about the money. I told her she's probably just forgetting things. Keep documenting everything that makes her seem confused or paranoid. The lawyer says we need more evidence of cognitive decline before we can proceed with the conservatorship. Cognitive decline. Conservatorship. They weren't just stealing from me, they were building a legal case to prove I was incompetent, to strip away my right to control my own life, to transform me into a ward of the state whose assets they could manage without my interference. Every time I'd questioned a financial discrepancy, every time I'd expressed concern about their behavior, every time I'd trusted my own instincts about what was happening to my life, they'd been documenting those moments as evidence of my mental deterioration. I don't know how long I sat there reading through that archive of betrayal. Long enough for the sun to climb high enough to warm my shoulders, long enough for Mrs. Patterson from apartment 3B to peek out her window and look concerned about the elderly woman having what appeared to be some kind of breakdown in the courtyard. Long enough for all the pieces of the past 2 years to rearrange themselves into a picture so clear and devastating that I wondered how I'd managed to miss it for so long. But I hadn't missed it, I realized. I'd felt it, sensed it, known in my bones that something was wrong. I'd simply been taught to doubt my own perceptions, trained to accept that my version of reality was less reliable than other people's interpretations of my behavior. I'd been gaslit so thoroughly and systematically that I'd begun to question my own sanity rather than trust the evidence of my own experience. Sarah's midnight burial hadn't been about hiding evidence from the authorities or protecting herself from criminal charges. It had been about hiding evidence from me, ensuring that I never found proof of what they'd been doing, never had documentation to contradict their narrative about my mental state. As long as I couldn't prove what was happening to me, their story about my decline would be the only version anyone heard. I gathered up the documents, sealed them back in their waterproof container, and carried that box into my apartment like the treasure it had become. Because that's what it was, treasure. Not gold or jewels or anything valuable in the traditional sense, but something far more precious, truth. Evidence. Proof that my instincts had been right, that my concerns had been valid, that I was still capable of recognizing betrayal when it was happening right in front of me. For the first time in months, I felt like myself again. Not the confused, paranoid, declining woman that my family had decided I'd become, but Margaret, Harold's wife, Michael's mother, a woman who'd lived long enough to recognize lies when she heard them and smart enough to know when she was being manipulated. I was still the same person who'd raised a son and buried a husband and built a life worth living. I was still someone whose thoughts and feelings and perceptions mattered, regardless of what anyone else had decided about my competence. I made copies of everything at the FedEx store on Michigan Avenue, handling the documents like they were made of glass and gold. The young man behind the counter helped me organize them into neat file folders, probably assuming I was dealing with routine financial paperwork rather than evidence of the most profound betrayal I'd ever experienced. I thanked him with a warmth that seemed to surprise him, because when you've been treated like you don't exist for months, ordinary human kindness feels like a miracle. Back home, I called a lawyer, not the family attorney who'd known Michael since he was a child, but someone independent who could advise me without conflicts of interest or preconceived notions about my mental capacity. The receptionist squeezed me into an appointment that same afternoon, sensing perhaps the urgency in my voice or the barely controlled emotion that I couldn't quite hide behind politeness. Jennifer Walsh had been practicing elder law for 15 years, and she'd seen variations of my story more times than she cared to count. She listened to my account without interruption, reviewed my copied documents with expressions that shifted from concern to outrage to professional focus. When I finished my story, she leaned back in her chair and delivered news that was both validating and terrifying. "Mrs. Richardson, what you've described is textbook elder financial abuse," she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from experience with these situations. The forged signatures alone constitute multiple felonies, and the coordinated effort to establish grounds for an unwanted conservatorship could result in serious criminal charges for both your son and daughter-in-law. Criminal charges. The words hit me like nothing had prepared me for. I'd been thinking about this situation in terms of family dysfunction, relationship problems, emotional betrayal. But Jennifer was talking about crimes, about actions serious enough to result in prison sentences, about behavior that crossed the line from meanness into territory governed by courts and consequences. What happens now? I asked, feeling suddenly overwhelmed by the implications of what I'd uncovered. That depends on what you want to happen, she replied, handing me tissues I hadn't realized I needed. We can pursue criminal charges, civil remedies, or both. We can seek to recover the stolen money, prevent the fraudulent conservatorship they've been planning, and ensure that your legal rights are fully protected. But I need to know, what outcome do you want from this situation? What outcome did I want? For months, all I'd wanted was for my family to love me, to include me, to treat me with the basic respect due to someone who'd devoted her life to caring for them. I'd wanted Michael to defend me, to believe me, to see Sarah's behavior for what it really was. I'd wanted to feel like I mattered, like my thoughts and feelings had value, like my presence in their lives was a blessing rather than a burden. But sitting in that lawyer's office, surrounded by evidence of calculated cruelty and systematic theft, I realized those wants belonged to a different version of myself, the woman who'd still believed that love could overcome anything, that family bonds were stronger than greed or selfishness, that good intentions could somehow shield me from betrayal by people I'd trusted absolutely. That woman was gone, replaced by someone harder and softer at the same time. Harder because she now understood what people were capable of doing to those who loved them. Softer because she'd rediscovered her own worth, her own right to dignity and respect and truth. This new version of myself didn't want reconciliation or forgiveness or the kind of family harmony that requires victims to pretend they haven't been victimized. This new version wanted justice. I want them to stop, I said finally. I want to protect myself, and I want to make sure they can't do this to anyone else. Jennifer smiled, not with the condescending sympathy I'd grown accustomed to, but with the respect of one competent woman acknowledging another's strength. Then let's make sure they stop, she said. The next few days were a whirlwind of phone calls, document reviews, and strategic planning. Jennifer filed emergency motions to freeze my accounts and prevent any further unauthorized access. She coordinated with bank fraud investigators, Adult Protective Services, and the district attorney's office. She helped me understand my rights, my options, and the likely progression of both criminal and civil proceedings. But most importantly, she helped me understand that I wasn't alone anymore. For months, I'd felt isolated and powerless, surrounded by people who'd convinced me that my perceptions couldn't be trusted and my concerns weren't valid. Now I was surrounded by professionals whose job it was to protect people in my situation, people who took elder abuse seriously and had the tools to do something about it. The confrontation, when it came, was nothing like the careful, respectful conversation I'd once imagined having with my family about our problems. Instead, it was a meeting in Jennifer's conference room, with Michael and Sarah sitting across from us like defendants in a trial that had already reached its verdict. Sarah came prepared with her usual arsenal of concerned expressions and manipulative language, but the documented evidence made her performance irrelevant. When confronted with copies of the forged documents and fraudulent transactions, she initially tried to claim that I'd given her permission and simply forgotten about it. But Jennifer had prepared for that defense, producing handwriting analysis that proved the signatures weren't mine and bank security footage showing Sarah at ATMs using cards she'd never been authorized to possess. Michael's reaction was perhaps more painful than Sarah's, because it revealed how completely she'd managed to manipulate his perception of reality. Even when faced with irrefutable evidence of his wife's crimes, he seemed more concerned about the potential consequences for her than about the harm that had been done to me. "Mom, surely we can work this out as a family," he said, still trying to find a middle ground that would somehow excuse the inexcusable. "We stopped being a family the moment you decided I was too inconvenient to deserve honesty," I replied, surprised by how calm I sounded when my heart was breaking into pieces that would never fit back together properly. "We stopped being a family when you chose to support someone stealing from me rather than listening to me when I asked for help." The legal proceedings moved faster than I'd expected. Sarah's attempt to establish power of attorney based on my supposed incompetence fell apart when multiple psychological evaluations confirmed that I was perfectly capable of managing my own affairs. The criminal charges for identity theft, elder abuse, and financial exploitation were filed within 2 weeks of our conference room confrontation. The civil lawsuit to recover the stolen money and damages was filed simultaneously. But the most significant change wasn't happening in courtrooms or bank offices, it was happening inside me. For the first time in years, I woke up each morning feeling like I had purpose, like my thoughts and actions mattered, like I was living my own life rather than trying to earn acceptance in a family that had already decided I was dispensable. I was still alone in many ways, but I was no longer lonely, because loneliness comes from being disconnected from people who matter to you, and I'd finally accepted that Michael and Sarah had chosen not to matter to me anymore. Mrs. Patterson, my neighbor who'd noticed me having my breakdown in the courtyard, turned out to be exactly the kind of friend I'd needed all along. She was a retired social worker who recognized the signs of elder abuse and had been worried about me for months. She'd noticed the changes in my demeanor, the way I'd grown quieter and more withdrawn, the sadness that followed family visits rather than the joy that should have accompanied time with loved ones. I kept waiting for the right moment to say something. She told me over coffee in her apartment one afternoon while we waited for news about Sarah's plea negotiations. But it's hard to know how to tell someone that the people they love might be hurting them. People don't want to hear that kind of truth. People don't want to hear that kind of truth. She was right, of course. I'd spent months deflecting my own suspicions, making excuses for behavior that should have been inexcusable, choosing to believe in love that didn't exist rather than acknowledging betrayal that was happening right in front of me. The truth had been available all along, but I hadn't been ready to receive it until the evidence became too overwhelming to ignore. Sarah eventually accepted a plea agreement that included restitution, probation, and a restraining order that prohibited her from contacting me or accessing any of my financial accounts. She'd avoided prison, but she'd lost access to Harold's life insurance money and the comfortable retirement she'd been planning to fund with my assets. More importantly, she'd lost the ability to continue victimizing me, and that felt like victory enough. Michael's reaction to his wife's conviction was to blame me for destroying his marriage and threatening his family's financial security. He accused me of being vindictive, of pursuing legal action when I should have been trying to preserve family relationships, of caring more about money than about love and forgiveness. He never apologized for not believing me, never acknowledged that his wife had been systematically stealing from his mother, never seemed to understand that I'd been the victim rather than the villain in this situation. His final words to me, delivered in a voicemail I saved but never answered, revealed how completely Sarah had succeeded in poisoning his perception of our relationship. "I hope you're satisfied, Mom. You got your money back, but you've lost your family. I hope it was worth it." Lost your family. As if a family was something you could lose rather than something you could be expelled from. As if I'd made the choice to prioritize financial justice over relationships rather than simply refusing to accept abuse disguised as love. As if the family I'd lost had ever really existed anywhere but in my imagination and memory. But he was wrong about satisfaction. I wasn't satisfied, I was free. Free from the constant anxiety of trying to please people who'd decided I was unpleasable. Free from the exhausting effort of earning acceptance from people who'd already determined I was unacceptable. Free from the heartbreaking work of loving people who responded to that love with exploitation and manipulation. The money, when it was recovered, mattered less than I'd expected it would. It provided security and options, but more importantly, it provided validation that my concerns had been real, my instincts had been accurate, my version of events had been true all along. It was proof that I hadn't been paranoid or confused or declining. I'd been the victim of crime serious enough to result in felony convictions and court-ordered restitution. With the legal proceedings concluded, I faced a question I'd been avoiding for months. What did I want the rest of my life to look like? I was 73 years old, alone, but finally free to make choices based on my own preferences rather than other people's expectations. I had enough money to live comfortably, enough health to remain independent, and enough hard-won wisdom to recognize the difference between solitude and loneliness. I started small. I bought new furniture to replace pieces that carried too many memories of happier times that had probably been illusions anyway. I painted my kitchen walls a shade of yellow that Harold would have hated, but that made me smile every morning when I made coffee in my favorite mug, a new one I'd chosen myself, without considering anyone else's taste or approval. I planted new flowers in the spot where Sarah had buried her box of lies, claiming that space for beauty instead of deception. Mrs. Patterson introduced me to her book club, a group of women my age who gathered monthly to discuss novels and share stories about their lives with the kind of honesty that only becomes possible when you've stopped caring what people think about your vulnerabilities. These women had survived divorces and deaths, raised difficult children and buried beloved spouses, navigated the challenges of aging in a world that often treats elderly women as invisible or irrelevant. They welcomed me with the understanding of people who knew that loneliness wasn't shameful, that starting over at 73 wasn't pathetic, that choosing yourself over family who mistreated you wasn't selfish. I started taking classes at the community college, art history and creative writing, subjects I'd always been interested in but never had time to pursue while I was busy being the kind of woman who prioritized everyone else's needs over her own interests. I discovered that I had opinions about contemporary fiction and pre-Columbian pottery, that I could write essays about subjects that mattered to me, that learning new things at my age wasn't just possible but energizing. The creative writing class introduced me to Patricia, a widow my age who'd moved to Chicago from Milwaukee after her husband died and her adult children decided she needed their supervision more than she needed her independence. Patricia had fled rather than submit to their loving control, and she understood the particular grief that comes with being disappointed by people you'd expected to protect you. We became friends first over shared stories of family dysfunction, but our friendship deepened around shared interests in literature and travel and the kind of authentic conversation that becomes possible when you've stopped pretending your life has been easier than it actually was. 6 months after Sarah's conviction, Patricia and I took our first trip together, a week in Santa Fe, where we visited art galleries and ate food that was too spicy and stayed up too late talking about books and possibilities and the strange freedom that comes with accepting that some relationships are too toxic to salvage. We shared a hotel room like college roommates, took pictures of each other in front of famous landmarks, and laughed about things that would have embarrassed us when we were younger and more concerned with maintaining dignity than embracing joy. That trip taught me something I'd forgotten during the years when my world had contracted around family obligations and the exhausting effort of earning love from people who'd already decided I wasn't worth loving. I was still interesting. I still had things to say and observe and experience. I still had preferences and opinions and desires that weren't entirely shaped by other people's needs or expectations. I was still a person worth knowing, worth spending time with, worth treating with respect and affection. The changes in me weren't just emotional, they were physical too. People started commenting that I looked younger, more energetic, more alive. My posture improved when I stopped carrying the weight of other people's disappointment in me. My voice got stronger when I stopped monitoring every word for potential offense or misunderstanding. I started wearing colors I liked instead of the muted tones I'd chosen to avoid attracting attention or criticism. I got my hair cut in a style that made me happy rather than one that seemed age-appropriate or properly modest. Dr. Martinez, my physician, noticed the improvements during my annual physical. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it," she said, reviewing test results that showed better numbers across the board: blood pressure, cholesterol, stress indicators. "You seem like a different person from the woman I saw last year." A different person. She was right, though it would be more accurate to say I'd become myself again, the person I'd been before I'd learned to see myself through the eyes of people who found me burdensome, inconvenient, too much trouble to treat with kindness. I was Margaret again, not just Michael's mother or Harold's widow or the elderly woman whose concerns needed to be managed rather than addressed. The first anniversary of Sarah's midnight burial passed without acknowledgement from anyone but me. I marked it by planting new roses in my garden, varieties I'd chosen for their beauty rather than their hardiness, flowers that required more care but provided more spectacular blooms. It seemed appropriate, tending something beautiful and vulnerable in the same spot where I discovered evidence of the ugliness people were capable of inflicting on those who loved them. Patricia helped me plant the new bushes, and we celebrated with wine and cheese and the kind of comfortable silence that develops between friends who've shared significant experiences. We didn't talk about the anniversary or what it represented, we just acknowledged it by creating something beautiful together, by transforming a site of betrayal into a source of joy and color and new growth. Michael sent me a Christmas card that year, the first communication I'd received from him since that angry voicemail after Sarah's conviction. It was generic, a printed message about peace and goodwill with his name signed in handwriting I barely recognized. No mention of our estrangement, no acknowledgement of what had happened between us, no indication that he understood the difference between seasonal politeness and genuine reconciliation. I kept the card for a few days, trying to decide if it represented an olive branch or just an attempt to relieve his own guilt, then ultimately threw it away because the distinction didn't matter anymore. I'd learned to stop waiting for apologies that would never come, explanations that wouldn't change anything, acknowledgments of wrongdoing from people who'd convinced themselves they were the victims in situations where they'd been the aggressors. I'd learned to stop measuring my worth by other people's willingness to value me, stop gauging my happiness by other people's approval, stop defining my success by my ability to maintain relationships with people who demonstrated they weren't capable of healthy relationships with me. The second year of my new life brought opportunities one hadn't imagined when I was consumed with trying to be the perfect mother, mother-in-law, and grandmother to people who responded to perfectionism with increased demands and decreased gratitude. I started volunteering with an organization that provided support to elder abuse victims, people whose stories resembled mine but whose outcomes might be different because they had advocates who understood their situations and resources to help them navigate legal and emotional challenges. Working with other elder abuse survivors taught me that my experience, while deeply personal and uniquely painful, was part of a larger pattern of exploitation that happened to thousands of older adults every year. I met women who'd been financially abused by their children, men whose caregivers had stolen from them, people whose families had manipulated them into signing away their rights while convincing them it was for their own good. I learned that elder abuse was often perpetrated by family members, that victims were frequently ashamed to report it, and that society's tendency to dismiss elderly people's concerns as confusion or paranoia made prosecution difficult even when evidence existed. But I also met survivors who'd found ways to rebuild their lives after devastating betrayals, people who discovered strength they didn't know they possessed and sources of joy they'd forgotten existed. I met women who'd started new careers in their 70s, men who'd found love again after divorcing abusive spouses, people who'd created new families from friends and chosen relationships and communities that valued them for who they were rather than what they could provide. My volunteer work introduced me to Elena, the program director who'd been working in elder advocacy for 20 years. Elena was 55, the daughter of parents who'd been financially exploited by her brother, and she understood both the family dynamics that enabled elder abuse and the systemic changes needed to prevent it. She became my mentor in advocacy work and eventually one of my closest friends, someone who appreciated my insights as both a survivor and someone with the education and resources to help others in similar situations. You have a gift for this work, Elena told me after I'd been volunteering for 6 months. You understand what it feels like to not be believed, but you also know what it takes to fight back successfully. That combination gives you credibility with victims who might not trust someone who hasn't been where they are. Under Elena's guidance, I started speaking at conferences about elder abuse prevention and victim advocacy. I testified at legislative hearings about needed reforms to adult protective services. I wrote articles for senior publications about recognizing and reporting financial exploitation. I discovered that my experience, as painful as it had been to live through, had given me knowledge and perspective that could help other people avoid similar victimization or find their way through it if prevention hadn't been possible. The public speaking was terrifying at first. I'd never been comfortable being the center of attention, and discussing the most humiliating experience of my life in front of strangers required a kind of courage I'd never needed to develop. But I learned that sharing my story could help other people recognize warning signs in their own families, validate their concerns when they felt something was wrong, and understand that fighting back didn't make them vindictive or ungrateful, it made them self-protective and strong. After one particularly well-received presentation at a conference for elder law attorneys, a woman approached me with tears in her eyes. She was about my age, impeccably dressed and obviously well-educated, but her hands were shaking as she introduced herself. "I think my son-in-law is stealing from me," she whispered, glancing around as if she were confessing to a crime rather than reporting one. "But he's so charming, and my daughter loves him, and I don't want to cause trouble. Everyone keeps telling me I'm imagining things, but the numbers don't add up, and I feel crazy all the time." I recognized everything she was describing: the self-doubt, the fear of family conflict, the isolation that comes with suspecting betrayal by people you're supposed to trust absolutely. I gave her Elena's contact information and resources for legal help, but more importantly, I told her what I'd needed someone to tell me years earlier: trust your instincts. Document everything. You're not imagining things, you're not going crazy, and protecting yourself doesn't make you the villain. 6 months later, she sent me a card with a photo of herself on vacation in Italy, looking relaxed and happy in a way that suggested she'd found her way through her own darkness. "Thank you for believing me when I couldn't believe myself," she'd written. "Your story gave me permission to save my own life. Your story gave me permission to save my own life." Those words sat with me for days afterward, helping me understand something I hadn't fully grasped about the value of survival and the importance of testimony. By refusing to be ashamed of what had happened to me, by speaking publicly about betrayal and recovery, by insisting that elder abuse was a crime rather than a family matter, I was giving other people permission to recognize their own victimization and take steps to protect themselves. The 3rd anniversary of Sarah's conviction arrived during a particularly cold Chicago winter, but I marked it with more celebration than mourning. Patricia and I had dinner at a new restaurant downtown, toasting our friendship and our shared understanding that starting over in your 70s wasn't a consolation prize, it was an achievement. We'd both learned to see our late-life independence not as abandonment by ungrateful families, but as liberation from relationships that had required us to diminish ourselves in order to maintain them. Elena joined us for dessert, bringing news about recent legislative victories that would make it easier for elder abuse victims to report crimes and recover stolen assets. We talked about upcoming projects, conferences where I'd been invited to speak, and articles I was working on for publications that reached audiences who needed to understand that elder abuse wasn't just a problem for other people's families, it could happen to anyone whose age or vulnerability made them targets for exploitation. But mostly we talked about ordinary things: books we'd read, movies we'd enjoyed, travel plans for the coming year. We were three women who'd found friendship in the aftermath of life experiences that could have left us bitter and isolated, but we'd chosen hope over despair, connection over withdrawal, advocacy over silence. We'd learned that survival wasn't just about enduring difficult experiences, it was about transforming them into sources of strength and wisdom that could benefit both ourselves and others. The conversation that evening helped me realize how completely my relationship with my own story had changed. For years, I'd seen my experience with Michael and Sarah as a failure, my failure to be a better mother-in-law, my failure to recognize warning signs, my failure to maintain family relationships despite impossible circumstances. But now I understood it as a success story, my success in recognizing abuse, fighting back effectively, rebuilding my life around relationships and activities that honored my worth, and using my experience to help others in similar situations. That night, walking home through the quiet streets of my neighborhood, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Harold was alive, complete contentment with my life exactly as it was. Not perfect, I still missed having family connections, still sometimes felt lonely on holidays, still wished Michael had been the man I'd tried to raise him to be. But content, because my life finally belonged entirely to me, because my days were filled with people and activities I'd chosen rather than obligations I'd inherited, because I knew my own worth independent of other people's willingness to recognize it. I was 76 years old, living alone but not lonely, financially secure and emotionally strong, surrounded by friends who valued me and engaged in work that gave my experience meaning beyond personal suffering. I had roses blooming in my garden despite Chicago winters, art classes that challenged my assumptions about creativity, and a community of people who shared both struggles and celebrations without keeping score or demanding payment for their affection. The apartment that had once felt like a cage now felt like a sanctuary. The silence that had once emphasized my isolation now provided space for reflection and peace. The independence that had once frightened me now represented freedom to make choices based on my own preferences rather than other people's expectations or demands. Dr. Martinez confirmed what I already knew during my most recent physical exam. I was healthier at 76 than I'd been at 70, not just physically but in ways that couldn't be measured by medical tests. My blood pressure was normal, but more importantly, I wasn't carrying the constant stress of trying to please people who decided I was inherently displeasing. My cholesterol levels had improved, but more importantly, I wasn't consuming myself with worry about relationships that had already been poisoned beyond recovery. "You're a testament to the importance of life changes at any age," Dr. Martinez told me as she reviewed my test results. "You've proven that it's never too late to prioritize your own well-being. Never too late to prioritize your own well-being." Those words would have seemed selfish to the woman I'd been 5 years earlier, the woman who'd believed that good people always put family first, that mothers never stopped earning their children's love, that maintaining relationships was always more important than maintaining self-respect. But the woman I'd become understood that you can't give what you don't have, that you can't love others well if you don't love yourself enough to demand respectful treatment, that some relationships require you to betray yourself in order to preserve them, and those relationships aren't worth preserving. Last month, Patricia and I returned from a 2-week trip to Ireland, where we'd explored castles and countryside and discovered that adventure wasn't limited to young people with unlimited energy and optimistic assumptions about the future. We'd stayed in bed and breakfasts run by couples our age, hiked trails that challenged our 70-something knees, and spent evenings in pubs listening to traditional music while drinking beer that would have scandalized our younger, more proper selves. The trip reminded me that the world was still full of beauty and wonder and experiences worth having, that age didn't disqualify me from pleasure or discovery or the simple joy of being somewhere new with someone whose company I enjoyed. I took hundreds of photographs, not to prove anything to anyone, but to preserve memories of a time when I felt fully alive and completely myself, when every day brought something unexpected and delightful. Patricia and I had shared a room again, talking late into the night about everything and nothing, comfortable with the kind of honest intimacy that develops between people who've stopped pretending their lives have been easier than they actually were. She understood my story because she had her own version of it, adult children who'd tried to control rather than support her, family members who'd mistaken her kindness for weakness, people who'd assumed that reaching 70 meant surrendering autonomy and accepting whatever treatment others decided was appropriate. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked one evening as we sat by our hotel window watching the sun set over the Irish countryside. "Fighting back instead of just going along with what they wanted?" I considered her question carefully, thinking about the Michael I'd lost, or perhaps more accurately, the Michael who'd never really existed except in my imagination. I thought about the family gatherings I no longer attended, the holidays I spent with chosen friends instead of biological relatives, the grandchildren I might never see again because their parents had decided I was too difficult to include in their lives. "I regret that it was necessary," I said finally. "I regret that love wasn't enough, that being a good mother didn't guarantee having a good son, that wanting the best for someone didn't protect me from their willingness to exploit that love. But I don't regret fighting back. I don't regret choosing dignity over harmony, truth over peace, self-respect over family approval. Patricia nodded with the understanding of someone who'd made similar choices and live with similar consequences. It's the hardest lesson, isn't it, she said. Learning that some people will only love you as long as you're useful to them, and that real love, the kind worth having, doesn't require you to disappear in order to maintain it. Real love doesn't require you to disappear in order to maintain it. That sentence stayed with me during our remaining days in Ireland and for weeks after we returned to Chicago. It helped me understand something I'd been struggling to articulate about the difference between the family relationships I'd lost and the friendships I'd gained, between the love I'd once accepted and the love I now insisted upon receiving. Harold had loved me in the way Patricia described, completely and without conditions or demands that I diminish myself to deserve his affection. He'd seen my flaws and chosen to love me anyway, supported my dreams even when they meant less attention for him, valued my happiness as much as his own. That kind of love had made me larger, stronger, more confident in my own worth. It had been a source of strength rather than a constant test of adequacy. The love I'd sought from Michael and Sarah had required the opposite: constant proof of my worthiness, endless accommodation to their preferences, willingness to accept less and less respect in exchange for smaller and smaller gestures of inclusion. That kind of love had diminished me, made me doubt my own perceptions, taught me to see myself through the eyes of people who found me inherently lacking. Understanding the difference between those two types of love helped me stop mourning what I'd lost when I fought back against financial and emotional abuse. I hadn't lost love, I'd escaped from a counterfeit version of it that had been slowly poisoning my sense of self-worth. I'd traded relationships that required me to disappear for relationships that celebrated my presence, connections that diminished me for connections that honored who I really was. The roses in my garden bloomed spectacularly last summer, the new varieties I'd planted proving even more beautiful than I'd hoped. Mrs. Patterson and Elena and Patricia all commented on how lovely they looked, how the bright colors seemed to transform the entire courtyard, how impressive it was that someone my age was still creating new beauty instead of just maintaining old memories. Someone my age. The phrase would have stung 5 years ago, when I was sensitive about every reference to my advancing years, when age felt like a limitation rather than an achievement. But now I heard it as acknowledgement of something remarkable, that at 76, I was still growing, still changing, still choosing hope over resignation, still creating beauty in places where ugliness had once flourished. I tend those roses every morning now, checking for new buds and signs of disease, watering and fertilizing and providing the kind of careful attention that helps beautiful things thrive despite challenging conditions. It's become a meditation of sorts, a daily reminder that growth is possible at any stage of life, that the right care can help damaged things bloom again, that starting over isn't failure, it's courage. The spot where Sarah buried her box of lies is now the site of my most spectacular rose bush, a climbing variety with blooms so fragrant that neighbors stop to comment when they pass by. Every time I see it, I remember that night when I discovered evidence of betrayal that shattered my illusions about my family but ultimately set me free to build a life based on truth instead of hope for love that would never materialize. Sometimes people ask if I miss my son, if I ever consider trying to reconcile with Michael despite everything that happened. The question assumes that forgiveness requires relationship, that loving someone means accepting whatever treatment they're willing to provide, that maintaining family connections is always worth the cost in self-respect and emotional well-being. But I've learned that you can love people from a distance, that forgiveness doesn't require putting yourself back in position to be hurt again, that some relationships are too toxic to survive no matter how much history they carry. I will always love the little boy who called me mommy and held my hand crossing streets and cried when I left him at kindergarten on the first day of school. But that little boy grew into a man who chose his wife's criminal behavior over his mother's well-being, who preferred comfortable lies to difficult truths, who was willing to sacrifice my security and independence rather than confront problems in his marriage. I can hold both of those realities simultaneously: love for who he was and acceptance of who he became, grief for the relationship we might have had and gratitude for the life I've built without it. Missing someone doesn't mean you should accept mistreatment from them. Loving someone doesn't mean you have to keep trying to earn their love in return. Family bonds don't override personal boundaries or excuse behavior that would be unacceptable from anyone else. 6 months ago, I received a letter forwarded through Jennifer's office. Apparently Sarah and Michael had tried multiple ways to contact me directly before resorting to official channels. The letter was from Michael, several pages of handwritten text that began with an apology for misunderstandings that had damaged our relationship and continued with explanations for behavior that he now characterized as mistakes rather than crimes. The letter revealed that Sarah had left him, taking their children and most of their assets while he dealt with the professional and financial consequences of being married to someone convicted of elder abuse. His accounting practice had suffered when clients learned about his family situation. His children were angry with him for not protecting their grandmother from their mother's crimes. His life had essentially collapsed around him, and he was reaching out to me for support, understanding, and presumably financial assistance. Reading that letter, I felt many things: sadness for the man who'd once been my beloved child, anger at the assumption that I would help him after he'd failed to help me, frustration with his continued refusal to take full responsibility for his choices. But mostly I felt relief that I was no longer the kind of person who would sacrifice her own well-being to rescue someone who demonstrated they couldn't be trusted with her love. I didn't respond to the letter. Not because I wanted to punish Michael, but because I had nothing to say that would benefit either of us. I couldn't undo the choices he'd made or the consequences those choices had created. I couldn't restore trust that had been so thoroughly destroyed or rebuild a relationship that had been based on my willingness to accept unacceptable treatment. I couldn't go back to being the mother who enabled rather than expected respectful behavior, who made excuses rather than demanded accountability, who confused love with the willingness to be victimized. Instead, I focused on the relationships and activities that brought joy rather than drama to my daily life. Patricia and I planned another trip, this time to New Zealand, where we'd heard the hiking trails were spectacular and the wine was world-class. Elena and I worked on expanding the elder advocacy program to reach more victims and provide more comprehensive services. I continued my art classes and volunteer work, and the simple pleasures of a life lived entirely on my own terms. The writing class I joined led to an unexpected opportunity when our instructor suggested I submit some of my essays about elder abuse to publications that focused on senior issues. The first piece I published was about recognizing financial exploitation by family members, a topic I could discuss with the authority of lived experience and the perspective of someone who'd successfully fought back. The response to that article was overwhelming. Letters from readers who recognized their own situations in my story, requests from advocacy organizations for permission to reprint the piece, invitations to speak at events focused on elder abuse prevention and victim support. I discovered that my voice, silenced for so long by people who preferred my compliance over my honesty, had power when used to help others find their own strength. Writing became another form of therapy, another way of transforming painful experiences into something that could benefit both myself and others. Each essay helped me process different aspects of what had happened to me while potentially helping readers avoid similar situations or find courage to address them. I wrote about the psychology of financial exploitation, the legal remedies available to elder abuse victims, the emotional journey from victimization to empowerment, and the unexpected gifts that could emerge from experiences that initially seemed like nothing but loss. One particular essay, about the difference between family loyalty and family exploitation, was reprinted in dozens of publications and generated more reader mail than anything I'd ever written. People wrote to thank me for articulating feelings they'd struggled to express, for validating experiences they'd been ashamed to discuss, for providing hope that it was possible to rebuild after family betrayal. "You helped me understand that protecting myself wasn't selfish," wrote one reader. "You showed me that I could love my daughter and still refuse to let her steal from me," wrote another. "Your story gave me permission to choose dignity over desperation," wrote a third. Those letters taught me something profound about the power of testimony, about the importance of telling truth even when it's uncomfortable, about the responsibility that comes with surviving experiences that others might not survive. My story, as painful as it had been to live through, had become a gift I could offer to people facing similar challenges, proof that it was possible to fight back successfully, evidence that survival was not only possible but could lead to a life more authentic and fulfilling than what had come before. Now, as I sit in my sunny kitchen on this quiet Tuesday morning, surrounded by the artifacts of a life I've finally learned to live entirely for myself, I think about how much has changed since that midnight in November when I watched my daughter-in-law bury a box of secrets in my garden. The roses in that spot are blooming now, their fragrance drifting through my open window like a message from the universe that beauty can grow from the sites of our deepest wounds. I'm 77 years old now, older than I ever imagined I'd be when I was young and assumed that aging meant gradual decline and increasing dependence on ungrateful family members. Instead, I've learned that aging can mean liberation, freedom from the expectations and obligations that once constrained my choices, permission to prioritize my own well-being, license to insist on respectful treatment from the people in my life. The phone rings occasionally with calls from people who've read my articles or heard my speeches, people who need someone to tell them they're not imagining the abuse they're experiencing, that their concerns are valid, that fighting back doesn't make them bad people. Those conversations remind me that my story serves a purpose beyond my own healing, that survival can be an act of service when it's shared with others who need hope and practical guidance. Patricia and I are leaving for New Zealand next month, planning to spend 3 weeks exploring a country neither of us ever expected to visit. We're traveling with the confidence of women who've learned to navigate the world without permission from anyone else, who've discovered that adventure doesn't require youth or traditional family support, who found that the best travel companions are people who appreciate your company without trying to change or control or exploit you. Elena has asked me to co-author a book about elder abuse prevention and recovery, combining my survivor's perspective with her professional expertise to create a resource that could help both potential victims and the people who serve them. The project excites me because it represents another way to ensure that my experience serves a purpose beyond personal growth, that the pain I endured might prevent others from experiencing similar betrayal. Mrs. Patterson still brings me cookies on holidays, and we still share coffee and conversations about books and current events and the small dramas of daily life in our building. She's become the kind of neighbor I never expected to find, someone who offers friendship without demands, support without strings, company without drama. She reminds me that family isn't just about blood relations, that love can develop between people who choose each other rather than inherit each other. The community college classes continue to challenge and engage me in ways I'd forgotten were possible. Last semester's course on American history helped me understand my own experience within the broader context of social change and generational conflict. This semester's creative writing workshop is pushing me to explore new forms of expression, new ways of telling stories that matter. Dr. Martinez continues to marvel at my health improvements, but I know the secret isn't just about leaving stressful relationships behind, it's about embracing relationships and activities that honor who I really am rather than demanding that I become someone else. When you stop living your life trying to earn other people's approval, when you start making choices based on your own values and preferences, when you surround yourself with people who celebrate rather than merely tolerate your existence, your entire body responds with renewed energy and vitality. The legal proceedings are finally completely resolved, all stolen funds recovered, all fraudulent accounts closed, all documentation properly filed to prevent any future unauthorized access to my assets. Jennifer has become more friend than attorney, someone I can call for advice or just to share news about my latest adventures and accomplishments. She often tells me that my case was one of her favorites because it demonstrated that elder abuse victims can fight back successfully when they have the right support and resources. Sometimes, late at night when the city is quiet and I'm sitting in Harold's old chair reading or just thinking about how different my life has become, I experience moments of pure contentment that I'd forgotten were possible. Not happiness exactly, that's too energetic a word for what I feel. Contentment. Peace. Satisfaction with choices I've made and the person I've become through making them. I think about the woman I was 5 years ago, anxious, self-doubting, willing to accept crumbs of affection from people who should have been offering full meals, confused about why love seemed to require so much sacrifice of self-respect. That woman was trapped in relationships that required her to diminish herself, caught in patterns of giving more and receiving less, unable to recognize exploitation because she'd been taught that good people always prioritized others' needs over their own well-being. The woman I am now understands that real love enhances rather than diminishes, that healthy relationships involve mutual respect and reciprocal care, that maintaining boundaries isn't selfish, it's essential. She knows her own worth independent of other people's willingness to acknowledge it. She chooses connections that celebrate her presence rather than merely tolerating it. She's learned that being alone is preferable to being with people who don't value what she has to offer. The boxes of photographs I once studied nostalgically, searching for evidence of happier times that might not have been as happy as I remembered, now sit in a closet largely unexamined. Not because the memories they contain aren't valid, but because the present moment has become more compelling than the past, the future more promising than what came before. I've learned to measure my life by what I'm creating rather than what I've lost, by who I'm becoming rather than who I used to be. The greatest gift of surviving elder abuse, I've discovered, isn't just the recovery of stolen money or the prevention of future exploitation, it's the recovery of myself. The woman who'd been slowly disappearing under the weight of other people's expectations and demands has re-emerged stronger and clearer about what she wants from the time she has remaining. The voice that had been silenced by people who preferred compliance over honesty has found new purposes and audiences that value truth-telling over peacekeeping. Every morning when I water my roses, I think about the night I discovered that box buried among them and how that discovery changed everything. Not just the practical aspects of my life, the financial security, the legal protections, the freedom from exploitation, but the essential understanding of who I am and what I deserve from the people I allow into my life. The roses bloom now without secrets buried beneath them, in soil that's been cleaned of deception and fed with honesty. They grow strong and fragrant not despite the harsh Chicago winters but because they've learned to survive difficult conditions, to conserve their energy for blooming season, to attract the kind of attention that appreciates rather than exploits their beauty. Like those roses, I've learned to bloom again after experiencing conditions that could have destroyed me. I've learned to save my energy for relationships and activities that nurture rather than drain me. I've learned to attract people who appreciate my presence rather than merely tolerate it, who value my contributions rather than seeing them as obligations I owe in exchange for basic consideration. The story I'm telling you isn't just about surviving elder abuse, though that's certainly part of it. It's about discovering that it's never too late to insist on respectful treatment, never too late to choose dignity over desperation, never too late to build a life that honors who you really are rather than who other people need you to be. It's about learning that family isn't just about blood relations, that love isn't just about history and obligation, that home isn't just about familiar surroundings but about being with people who see and value your authentic self. If you've listened to my story and recognized elements of your own experience, if you've felt that familiar ache of loving people who respond with exploitation rather than gratitude, if you've questioned your own perceptions because others have convinced you they can't be trusted, if you've wondered whether demanding respectful treatment makes you selfish or unreasonable, I want you to know that your instincts are probably right. Your concerns are likely valid, and protecting yourself doesn't make you the villain in your own story. Have you ever lived through something similar? Have you known someone whose kindness was mistaken for weakness, whose love was exploited rather than returned, whose trust was violated by people who should have protected it? Have you watched someone disappear slowly under the weight of other people's expectations until they forgot who they were before those expectations began to define them? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story matters, your experience has value, and speaking truth about family dysfunction isn't disloyalty, it's courage. If this video has resonated with you, please like it and subscribe so this message can reach others who might need to hear that it's possible to choose themselves over people who've chosen to exploit them, that survival is not just possible but can lead to a life more authentic and fulfilling than anything that came before. Thank you for listening to my story, for witnessing my journey from victimization to empowerment, for understanding that sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to accept treatment that diminishes your dignity. Thank you for believing that 77-year-old woman can still grow and change and bloom, that it's never too late to start over, never too late to insist on being seen and valued for who you really are.